The America's Democrats podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, is made possible by contributions from our listeners. Want to do more? Go to americasdemocrats.org and click Donate. And thank you for allowing us to be your voice. And if you enjoy the show, please share it with your friends on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. This week, why progressive Democrats must fight for a better NAFTA deal. Why labor unions should fight for the Green New Deal. Plus, Bill Press on the wall, the shutdown, Medicare for all, and more with Kentucky Representative Jim Yarmuth. Had enough of Fox News, the House Freedom Caucus, and Donald Trump? If you want the facts that you won't get from them or from the fake news sites of the alt-right, then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. Sometime later this year, NAFTA 2.0, the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement, is expected to go into effect. Is it better than the old NAFTA? Lori Wallach is a 25-year veteran of congressional trade battles, starting with the 1990s fight over NAFTA. She says the New Deal has a long way to go to repair the damage of the first. And we say hello to Lori Wallach, Director of Public Citizens Global Trade Watch. Lori, thank you so much for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
Thank you.
It's nice to have you with us. Before we look forward, let's look back for a moment. Your organization just recently released a report titled Fracaso, NAFTA's Disproportionate Damage to U.S., Latino, and Mexican Working People. It's a remarkable assessment of almost 25 years of the impact. What are the top lines from that report?
Well, and more interestingly, actually, we're doing a live, online, interactive release at tradewatch.org of that data, hot linked back to the original government sources. So to summarize what you will find in that report, and now even in the even easier to access infographic, we have had 1 million U.S. jobs government certified as lost to NAFTA. And that is just under one narrow program that is hard to qualify for, so it undercounts the damage. That, in contrast to the promise that NAFTA would create 1 million jobs in its first 5 years alone. But the bigger impact actually is on wages, because those 1 million jobs are manufacturing jobs. And though the total number of jobs in the economy stayed fairly consistent, short of the Great Recession, the jobs that replaced the manufacturing jobs paid half as much. They were lower wage service sector jobs. So what we've basically seen is U.S. wages flat, even in the growing non-offshorable, lower wage service sector fields, because all those displaced manufacturing workers then tried to get jobs in those sectors. And by the way, you don't have to believe me in the sort of basic economics 101. The U.S. Department of Labor's Bureau of Labor Statistics actually documents that, and this, by the way, is going on every week. More jobs are being offshored to Mexico every week. In 2017, manufacturing workers who lost their jobs to trade, 2 out of 5 took a pay cut, and of that bunch, 20% of them, a fifth, took a pay cut that was bigger than 20%. And if you look at the median wage for manufacturing workers, that's a $7,000 pay cut. That is the difference between middle-class, comfortable life and having to worry if your wages are going to meet your expenses every damn month. So that would be bad enough. But in addition, just as the environmentalists predicted, under NAFTA, corporations have grabbed from taxpayers almost $400 million in those investor state attacks on environmental and health laws. Those are the tribunals where the corporations can sue the governments outside our courts in front of 3 corporate lawyers and get unlimited compensation, including for their expected lost future profits for any domestic environmental or health law that they think undermines their rights. And the final thing I would say, because it sounds like we're the only ones who've been on the losing end, but folks need to understand, Trump's got this whole diagnosis of how this happened wrong. NAFTA wasn't some sneaky plot by Mexico against the U.S. It was corporations against working people in general. And the harshest evidence of that is in Mexico. Average annual real wages are down. They're down 2%. And they were not livable before NAFTA. Right now, if you can imagine, wages in Mexico are 40% cheaper than in China.
Wow. That's just, that's heart-wrenching. Let's look ahead to NAFTA 2.0. You've written extensively on the shortcomings of this new agreement. Let's start with the labor standards. How does that stack up?
So, by the way I would describe it, if I were a teacher and I had to give a grade on the NAFTA 2.0 that they signed on November 30th, I'd give it a big old honking incomplete, because they made some improvements that unions and progressives have demanded. They added some stuff that's worse, but then there's a bunch of stuff that just is not done. More work is needed. And number one on that list is the labor and the environmental standards. So the good news is they made some significant but not tremendous improvements in the labor standards. The one thing that is tremendous is there now is a provision that would require Mexico to abolish its fake protection unions. And in 4 years, every union that's basically one not approved by the workers, Mexico has to hold a secret ballot election by the workers to actually get a real contract that represents their demands. And that'll be huge, because part of how the wages have been held down is these fake contracts where the company cuts a deal with basically a fake union before the workers even get hired. And there's some other good improvements, and by the way, the environment chapter, not as strong. That needs to be beefed up, but neither of them are subject to swift and certain enforcement. Mm-hmm. And the hitch is, you can have great language on paper, but it's not going to change anyone's life unless it's enforced. So absent the Democrats winning much stronger enforcement of those terms, companies, U.S. companies, will keep outsourcing jobs to Mexico to pay people less, dump toxins, and send the stuff back here for sale. That has got to get fixed.
Wow. Well, and you've also been very critical of what this new agreement could do to the cost of pharmaceutical drugs. Help us understand that.
So, as I said, there's some that's better, there's some that's worse, and there's some that's undone. In the category of worse, the top line is new giveaways for big pharma that would lock in place our current medicine policies that keep prices high. For instance, there are new protections that would lock in the current monopolies that the makers of biologic medicines get. So biologic medicines are the cutting-edge drugs like the brand-new cancer treatments or Humira. And these drugs are subject to an extra protection on top of their normal 20 years of monopoly protection, and that's called marketing exclusivity. No, even if you don't have a patent, no one else can sell the stuff. So you can set these absurd $100,000 a year prices. So NAFTA would lock that in. Meanwhile, every single price reduction bill for medicines in Congress would either get rid of or lower that. So basically, if those provisions aren't removed from NAFTA, it's like pouring cement around our bad policy and locking it in place and exporting it to Mexico and Canada, where they don't have any of these sort of extreme pharmaceutical protecting provisions that we have here. So no doubt their medicine prices are considerably lower.
We're speaking with Lori Wallach, Director of Public Citizens Global Trade Watch, talking about NAFTA in the past and NAFTA in the future. Lori, what, if any, are what you would call some of the good aspects of NAFTA 2.0?
Well, the most important change, and it's a huge one, is those investor state tribunals I'd mentioned, where multinational corporations are empowered to attack U.S. laws in front of tribunals of 3 corporate lawyers, and the corporate lawyers can order us taxpayers to pay unlimited sums to the corporations. All the corporations have to do is convince the lawyers that some U.S. court ruling or environmental law or food safety regulation violates their grandiose NAFTA rights, And these guys aren't subject, the three lawyers aren't subject to appeal. So as I said, almost $400 million paid out on attacks on water, timber, toxics ban policies, energy policies. The NAFTA 2.0 totally eliminates that policy between the U.S. and Canada, which is huge, because believe it or not, that's where most of these attacks have happened, U.S. and Canadian corporations attacking the other government. And with Mexico, it replaces that outrageous parallel system for corporations, gets rid of most of the corporate protections, gets rid of all the corporate protections under which those big payouts have happened, and basically just leaves a situation where a U.S. investor in Mexico who gets their land expropriated can get to one of these tribunals, but only after going to domestic courts, proving it doesn't work, etc. So that is a huge problem that is largely fixed. And by the way, those investor rules have been a big incentive in outsourcing because they make it much cheaper and less risky to outsource. You know, once you put in your investment, boy, they raise wages, you can get money to make it up. So it basically means that a foreign investor from the U.S. and a company from the U.S. doesn't have to buy, say, insurance about the risks in Mexico. They just super cheap, super safe, off they go. So that is huge. Another thing that's pretty powerful, very powerful, is they strengthen what are called the rules of origin. So a rule of origin has to do with whether or not an actual product qualifies for NAFTA's duty-free treatment. And under the original NAFTA, almost half of a product could be coming from the value of it, could be sourced from China or another non-NAFTA country and still get treated like it was made in North America. And the new agreement closes a lot of loopholes and raises the number of the percentage of the product that has to be made in North America to 75%. And part of that is a third thing, the first time ever requirement that imports have to meet a certain wage level in order to get the duty-free benefits. So for 40 to 45% of the value of a vehicle, 40% for cars, 45% for light trucks, has to be made by a production worker earning on average $16 an hour, or it doesn't get the NAFTA benefits. First time ever in a trade agreement. Wow. Another big thing that got fixed is NAFTA had these obscene provisions that forced countries to continue to export natural resources, oil, gas, timber, but even lake water. Once you started selling it, it was deemed commodified, and you had to keep shipping it out no matter how much you decided to conserve, change your law, based on how much you sold in the previous 3 years. So that was now, it's called proportional sharing, technically, and that outrageous provision is whacked. Another thing that people will remember, older people like me will remember, is the whole NAFTA trucks fight, where NAFTA required us to allow trucks from either Mexico or Canada that did not meet our standards on driver safety, environmental standards, the safety of the truck, brakes, insurance. We had to let all the trucks drive throughout any of the U.S. And the U.S. tried not to implement that, and finally Mexico won a case in NAFTA and had $3 billion of sanctions hanging over our head. So the trucks were allowed from Mexico and Canada despite not meeting the standards. That's reversed in the new agreements. We can keep out any truck that doesn't meet our standards, and we can set our own standards for highway safety and truck environment rules. So that's good. Another thing that is, I think, pretty important is a rule that for the first time in a trade agreement actually has some enforceable rules about cheating on currency. And, some countries, not Mexico and Canada, but this is an important precedent to set, will lower the value of their currency to try and basically put a thumb on the scale for their imports to make them cheaper for us unfairly. And this has some rules. They're not strong enough, but it's the crowbar in the crevice. It is the beginning of having actually enforceable rules on currency. Those are some of the rules I think that are, probably the biggest improvements.
Well, and it's obviously, so we've seen some improvements. That's wonderful. It's probably not where we want it to be. But this agreement will go before the 116th Congress with a number of new progressive Democrats in office. what are your hopes they'll push for some of the changes that you'd still like to see?
Well, here's the deal. The agreement as is will not stop NAFTA's job outsourcing, the race to the bottom in wages, or the race to the bottom in environmental standards. So as is, that agreement, I do not believe, will get through the House of Representatives. In fact, I would bet my house on it would not get through the House of Representatives. So they are going to have to improve the deal. They're going to have to improve the enforcement. They're going to have to take out the outrageous giveaways for the big pharmaceutical corporations. They're going to have to strengthen the environmental standards. And how I see this playing out is even though the deal got signed on November 30th, in reality, that's just a step in the process. About half of the current U.S. free trade agreements had some change to their text or many changes after they were signed. Because a trade agreement that can't get through Congress is nothing but a paper doorstop. It's 800 pages of paper unless Congress approves it. Right. So I suspect that how this is going to play out, and it's going to play out this way explicitly and only because the Democrats took the House. And in that wave, in that blue wave, surfing on the top of it are some great progressives. I suspect the way it's going to play out is another round of negotiations is going to ensue between the top trade official in the U.S., who actually is a really smart guy, who's the guy who's behind those good changes, and he's going to have to talk to the Democrats about how the enforcement of the environmental and labor standards is going to make something that really matters, and some of these other key improvements get done so that a majority can be built. And my sense is for the Democrats, progressives know. Their standard is they must have an agreement that they know will stop some of NAFTA's ongoing damage. They will not support a deal that doesn't meet that standard. I mean, everyone recognizes that given we're dealing with the administrations of Donald Trump and the previous Mexican administration of Peña Nieto, now AMLO's in there, the new president, but the old guy was, super conservative business guy. And Trudeau, who pretends he's a big environmentalist, but he's the country that actually, Canada's the country that blocked all the environmental stuff in the NAFTA 2.0. With those three administrations, of course, we did not get the transformational replacement of the corporate rigged NAFTA model that progressives demanded. However, if progressives get those key changes, we could get a deal that would stop some of NAFTA's serious ongoing damage to people and the planet throughout North America, and that would be worth delivering.
And Lori, real quickly, what can our listeners do to engage on the issue and pressure their lawmakers?
So the number one most important thing to do is find your lawmakers at home. They're going to be home between now and the beginning of the year, but also every weekend, and at Martin Luther King's Day weekend, the week with Martin Luther King's Day in it, all the members of Congress will be home. Stop at an open house. You can make an appointment and go see the member. You can go to any event. A lot of them on their websites have local events that they're attending, ribbon cuttings, etc. Just grab them, shake their hand. Do not let go of their hand until they give you an answer and say, can I count on you to insist on the improvements needed to NAFTA, enforceable labor and environmental standards, get out the big pharma stuff in order to stop the damage, and that you won't support any deal that doesn't do that. The other very helpful thing is please go to replacenafta.org. That's www.replacenafta.org. That website has useful materials, fact sheets, etc., and it has a place to sign up so we can connect you with the local activists in your area. There's a national network of progressive activists since the NAFTA period in the 90s called the Citizens Trade Campaign. They have organizers across the country, and you can get folded into activists from the environmental, consumer, labor, family farm movement. Also, finally, check all your local online, the online groups, the local activist groups with whom you've been working, because in the faith community, the labor community, the environmental community, people are working on this issue. And the only way we're going to change it is if we all find one of those ways to get involved and make it happen.
Everybody, you have your assignment. Lori Wallach, Director of Public Citizens Global Trade Watch, joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast. Lori, thank you so much for your time. We look forward to having you back with us again soon.
Thank you.
Thank you. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
This Social Security measure, I believe that we must pass legislation to provide medical care.
This is our tradition. When our grandparents came to America, it was the Democratic Party which said, welcome. It was the Democratic Party, the party of Roosevelt and Truman and Kennedy and others, who said that America belonged to all its people, not just a handful of the rich or a few giant corporations. That's why great leaders like FDR fought so hard for Social Security, and why JFK stood up to the insurance companies and their Republican allies to get Medicare. It's not just one thing, or one time, in one place. It's about a whole history of standing up to the Republicans and saying someone has to be on the side of regular working people in America, whether it's defending Social Security or just the way your loved ones are treated on the job. That's what the Democratic Party is all about. And that's why this message has been brought to you by the Democratic Party. Working people like you and me.
Paid for by 21st Century Democrats. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Coming up next, what organized labor needs to ask of a Green New Deal. But first, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
With chaos in Washington, worsening climate disasters, more wars than we can count, and a wobbling economy here at home, the last thing we need is another big challenge. But look out, here comes a doozy. It's AI, artificial intelligence, the fast-evolving science of autonomous machines that can think, learn, and even reproduce themselves. Consider self-driving vehicles. Once the stuff of science fiction, the future is suddenly upon us, with Google, Daimler, and GM rolling out driverless taxis, commercial trucks, and even cars with no steering wheel or gas and brake pedals. An army of corporate lobbyists is rushing to legislative halls, literally changing the rules of the road to allow full deployment of these vehicles. What about the hundreds of thousands of professional drivers who will lose their jobs? Not our problem, say the financiers and AI barons who will profit from a mass botmobile conversion. Besides, as one AI champion coldly asserts, those drivers get sick, take vacations, etc. People are messy, he notes. Machines are straightforward. Indeed, so straightforward that these 2-ton, non-sentient drivers will be driving straight at a world of defenseless pedestrians. Already, one of Uber's experimental cars killed an Arizona pedestrian last year. We can fix that, says Andrew Ng, a prominent AI investor. They just have to be reprogrammed. By they, Ng doesn't mean the self-driving machines. He means we pedestrians must be reprogrammed. Please be lawful, he scolds, and please be considerate of the computer-driven vehicles. No jaywalking, obey pedestrian signs, give right-of-way to the new technology. This is Jim Hightower saying, so don't just prepare yourself for a brave new world of automation. Prepare to be re-educated so you can interact properly with machines and don't get in their way.
Need an antidote to the progressive blues? Want some good news about how grassroots folks are rebelling against the corporate powers and winning? Well, here's an easy-to-swallow pill for you, the Hightower Lowdown. Hightower's monthly newsletter will give you the lowdown, even as it lifts you up. It's 4 pages a month, jam-packed with facts you can use, actions you can take, and Jim's own Texas humor, all for only $15 a year. To become a lowdowner, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Our next guest works at the intersection between labor and social movements. He says that what Roosevelt's New Deal did for working Americans can happen again with the Green New Deal. And we say hello to Jeremy Brecher, documentary filmmaker, radio producer, and author of 15 books on labor and social movements, including Climate Insurgency, A Strategy for Survival, Against Doom, A Climate Insurgency Manual, and most recently, Climate Solidarity, Workers versus Warming. He is the research and policy director of the Labor Network for Sustainability and recently wrote an article for In These Times titled 12 Reasons Labor Should Demand a Green New Deal. Jeremy Brecher, thank you so much for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
Thank you.
Your article begins with a reminder of Roosevelt's New Deal. Why is it important to recall that history in this new context of climate change?
Well, the reason that everyone's talking about a New Deal and a Green New Deal is because a group called Sunrise of young people who are concerned about climate put out the idea of a Green New Deal while they were occupying Nancy Pelosi's office, not to oppose her, but to encourage Democrats to take a serious position on how we're going to address the climate crisis. And suddenly the idea took off, and now there are dozens of members of Congress who are supporting a select committee on the Green New Deal that will make a plan for how we can put millions of people to work on a Green New Deal that protects the climate and at the same time addresses our jobs problems. And the reason that the original New Deal has come up is because it is such a inspiring model of the American people getting together in cooperation with their government to address a terrible catastrophe. The catastrophe then was the Great Depression, but also, and this isn't so much known, a great ecological catastrophe that America had entered in the early decades of the 20th century with the Dust Bowls and with the farmland being depleted and terrible ecological conditions. And the New Deal essentially said, let's put millions of people to work fixing our problems. We'll fix the problem of unemployment by creating organizations like the Work Progress Administration that, along with others, put together jobs for 10 million people. Much smaller labor force in those days. It might be like 20 or 25 million people today, and address some of our other problems, like our depleted schools and infrastructure, which a lot of the work was directed towards fixing them, our broken environment, and a lot of the work was directed by them, perhaps most famous, the Civilian Conservation Corps, which put hundreds of thousands of young people who were unemployed and never gotten into the workforce to work planting trees, building fire breaks, and creating national forests that remain a prized part of our national heritage today. So the people who said we've got to do something about climate change and we've got to do something to put people who have either been pushed out of the workforce or who have terrible jobs and they have to have 2 or 3 of them just to make a living. We've got to do something. Let's put those things together. You know what? That's what they did in the original New Deal, and that's why what we need today is a Green New Deal.
Now, let's look specifically at the Green New Deal. 2 of your reasons why labor unions should support the deal is that it will, quote, provide jobs for all, close quote, and eliminate poverty. Now, those statements are apt to be met with skepticism, of course. So tell us what's in the deal that would work toward those goals.
Well, the basis for what I wrote about was a resolution by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez originally, although it now includes support from dozens of Democratic congresspeople, and it is calling for the creation of a select committee to make a plan, draw up legislation. So these are proposals, not final legislative clauses that can be put into practice immediately. And I think people are right to say, well, let's dig into the details here and see how this would actually work. I've done my best to give a sketch of it, but it's certainly not a final plan. But there's a lot of research and thinking that would underlie such a plan. And a couple of the ideas that are relevant here are, first of all, the idea of a climate jobs guarantee. Which would be we're told that we're in a time of full employment. Anyone who wants a job can get a job. I'm sure your listeners know that they can go and get 3 and 4 jobs. They're 4 hours a day or 12 hours a week, and they pay $7.50 an hour or $9 an hour. And if they get 3 or 4 of them, they might be able to make a living. But there are, in fact, 40 million people who are either outside the workforce, working part-time involuntarily, or working at jobs that pay less than $15 an hour. And so a jobs guarantee modeled somewhat on the New Deal's Works Progress Administration, WPA, that built all those schools and parks and public buildings that we can still find in many of our cities. The idea of the jobs guarantee is we'll put people to work doing those things. Anybody who wants to work will have a job, and most of those jobs will be directed towards retrofitting our buildings so that we aren't taking all of our energy and using it to heat the air. Some people think there's enough hot air floating around in our country already. So let's keep it in the buildings where it belongs, and putting out solar collectors and many other kind of retrofitting our factories and our farms so that they are much, much more energy efficient. These are all things we need to do to protect the climate, and they will also create millions and millions of jobs. And yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, you also write about how the Green New Deal could make an impact on the labor movement itself. You suggest it can unite the working class and build a powerful labor-friendly coalition. How do you envision that happening?
Well, we have a terrible problem. It almost makes me weep when I think about it. We have managed to divide the Democratic Party and the progressive forces in America against ourselves. Climate change is something that is devastating for everyone, and so are our economic problems and our lack of decent jobs. And yet somehow we've gotten into a situation where the issue gets defined over and over again as jobs versus environment. And if we're going to protect the environment, that's going to destroy workers' jobs. And this is perhaps the greatest weakness of the Democratic Party, and the greatest weakness of the labor movement and the environmental movement is this division. It's completely unnecessary. It's completely against the interests of working people who are perhaps more affected by the impacts of climate change than people who have the money to build storm-proof houses or go away when the floods come. Or when the forest fires come. So a program to address both climate change and jobs is exactly what we need to get over the divisions in the Democratic Party and in the progressive world, and create a program that will appeal. And by the way, when they do polls on these proposals, 70-80% of the population supports them. There's a recent poll showing that 2/3 of Republicans and even a majority of people who call themselves conservative Republicans approved of the underlying ideas, principles, and programs of the Green New Deal. So this is a way to move us to a whole new level as far as our politics, put the Trump nightmare behind us, and have a constructive approach that will create jobs for tens of millions of people and create a common political vision of what we want to do with our country for hundreds of millions of people.
We're speaking with Jeremy Brecher, documentary filmmaker, radio producer, author. He's also research and policy director for the Labor Network for Sustainability. And a recent article he wrote for In These Times is titled 12 Reasons Labor Should Demand a Green New Deal. Jeremy, another reason you suggest why unions should support the deal is that it could strengthen bargaining power. How would that work?
Well, we're told that we are in full employment, but as I said before, there are something like 16 million people who would like to work, but are unable to, are not even actively looking for work or are working part-time. And there's an old management slogan, a long line of job applicants at the door of the plant gives management all the bargaining power. If a worker is on a job and they say, you know what, I don't want to make $7.50 an hour. How about you pay me $15 an hour? The manager doesn't have to do anything except, oh, gee, there's another guy standing outside the door. We're going to give him your job. And so full employment is an absolutely central part of the bargaining strength of working people, both individually and especially when workers join together to bargain collectively through unions. And at the centerpiece of the Green New Deal is the idea of creating full employment by means of putting people to work, fixing the climate, and meeting our other urgent common needs. And that is number one reason, but there's a number two reason, which is all of these programs, if you look back at the original New Deal, it was really the time when the rights of labor and the conditions of workers were for the first time guaranteed. So workers won the right to organize and bargain collectively with their employers. They won labor standards in the Fair Labor Standards Act, and the first real restrictions on the hours of labor. Before that, people could be forced to work 16 hours a day. If they didn't like it, go look for another job. And the ability of people on the job to have some rights like freedom of speech and freedom of assembly that are guaranteed in the United States Constitution, but somehow when you walk through the door of the office or the gate of the plant, you're not covered by the United States Constitution anymore. Well, those things were tremendously increased by the original New Deal, and they were built in as labor rights, and they were passed in legislation because the idea was to create a new situation for the working class in America. And that is what the Green New Deal would do too. With all these millions of jobs, there would be a guarantee that the people in them have their basic rights, their rights to organize, their rights to freedom of speech. And similarly, the standards that would be created by the climate jobs guarantee would create a quality of jobs that means that the person who's working in a McDonald's for $7.50 or $9 an hour and can be fired instantly, and basically is someone without rights. We used to say a peon. They can go and work on the under the climate jobs guarantee. If their employer wants to keep a labor force, they want to keep workers to keep turning out those hamburgers, they're going to have to pay a competitive wage and provide competitive conditions. And that's going to create a major improvement in conditions, especially for workers who are toward the most disadvantaged part of the labor force. People who have been discriminated against because of their color, because of their gender, because of the way they look, because they're immigrants. This is going to make a tremendous improvement in their conditions, and also create the conditions for them to organize, like the Fight for 15, but they'll have a demand for labor and labor standards backing them up because of the Green New Deal.
And Jeremy, before we let you go, beyond what's already in the deal, you list more about what could be added to support labor. What are some additional provisions you'd like to see?
First of all, this is something that workers and unions and the labor movement in general really need to start thinking about and talking about. We've been so much on the defensive. We've lost so much that when we have something like the Janus decision that says we can't even collect dues from the people that the unions in the public sector are providing services for, that it's kind of weakened our imagination about what we want and what we deserve. But I think that the New Deal itself, the original New Deal, gives us a lot of ideas about what we ought to be demanding. And I think the first thing is the basic right to organize, bargain collectively, and the right to strike, which has been almost completely eroded by the courts and legislation. So I think that would be a crucial element to rebuilding the power of the labor movement, and meaning that workers are a little less like slaves and a little more like people with constitutional rights. I think that the basic labor standards in terms of hours of labor is important. Most people think that they have a right to some kind of due process on the job. They just assume it because we assume that there's some basic constitutional right to due process in America. But actually, under current labor law, workers can be fired any time without any reason, without any justification being provided. I think that basic fairness and basic right to due process, as this firing for cause is the legal terminology that's used for it. There has to be a just cause for someone to get fired. I think that would be a very important thing, especially in this modern economy where we have so much contingent work, so much work that's part-time and where people have no job security. That would be one step toward providing stable and secure and dignified labor for all of us who now face being laid off at the drop of a hat, possibly because we dared to mutter something about how our conditions weren't perfect.
Jeremy Brecher, documentary filmmaker, radio producer, author, also research and policy director for the Labor Network for Sustainability, joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast. Jeremy, thank you so much for your time with us today. We look forward to having you back again with us soon.
That would be great, and I hope this is something that your listeners can take to heart and put all of our shoulders to the wheel. The New Deal had a slogan, "We do our part." And I think that that's what we all can do here, both about climate and about fixing our economy.
Amen. Jeremy, thanks again for your time. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to keep the AmericasDemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, on the air, and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to AmericasDemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. And now, Bill Press talks with Kentucky Representative John Yarmuth about the political showdown over the wall and why he's proud to get an F from the NRA.
And welcome to the program, a very powerful man indeed from the United States Congress, who is not only a congressman representing Kentucky's 3rd Congressional District, he is also chair of the House Budget Committee, and chair, at least the last time I checked, of the House Bourbon Caucus.
Absolutely. Yeah, I would not surrender that
Don't
position.
Give that post up.
That's yours.
Congressman John Yarmuth, it's good to see you, sir.
Good to see you, Bill. I actually drank coffee this morning out of my Bill Press mug.
So, you did? Cool.
Just
good
to
for
prepare.
You.
That's weird. I was drinking bourbon out of my Bill Press mug this morning.
That's what I thought you were going to say.
No. Although happy hour, that's one of my standard lines now, that with Trump in office, happy hour in Washington's now 11 a.m.
Seriously.
Might as well be, right?
Too real.
Yeah.
So, Congressman, what is going on? If anybody can explain it, with Mitch McConnell. I mean, he has, in effect, abdicated his responsibility as Senate Majority Leader, saying, I will not bring anything up for a vote unless the President of the United States tells me ahead of time that he would sign it. Is
right.
that the constitutional role of Congress?
No. Excuse me, in a word, no. When he said that the first time, I went ballistic on him in local media and said, using the same words, this was an abdication of his responsibility. He's basically turned the legislative process over to the president, and we can't sustain our democracy that way. It's really, really unfortunate because this is the kind of situation that Mitch historically has been very effective in. I mean, when we've had these budget impasses, he's the one that brought people together and negotiated the deal. So for him specifically to be out of the game is really unfortunate. But you asked why. I can only guess. Two reasons. One is I think he was very chastened when Trump pulled the rug out from under him a few weeks ago in December, when he got word from the White House that they would sign that bill if he put it through. He got it virtually unanimously passed, the spending bills through the
I think it was unanimous.
Yeah. And then Trump reneged on that deal. And then secondly, he's up for re-election in 2020. He is very unpopular in Kentucky right now. He's polling right at 30% approval, 55% disapproval. And we've got a governor, also very unpopular, but who may very well challenge him in the primary.
Whoa.
So I think Mitch is kind of stuck in that position where he's, in Kentucky, is a lot less popular than Donald Trump is among Republicans. And, it's probably by 40 points difference. And I think he's just afraid to take Trump on. And apparently in the meeting yesterday in the White House, he was just stone silent, didn't say a word.
Well, he has been. I mean, other than the statement you and I've talked about.
Right.
Even the last White House meeting where the president came out to the Rose Garden with Kevin McCarthy and Steve Scalise and Mike Pence, and no Mitch McConnell.
No Mitch. Yeah.
Just chose not to stand there, and they said, well, he had so much busy work to do up at the Senate. The Senate wasn't in session.
Right. It's very unfortunate.
So he may be in more trouble.
I'm
sorry, he may be more trouble from a Republican in Kentucky than a Democrat in 2020, you think?
I think he's vulnerable to a Democrat as well, but I think he's more vulnerable to a Republican.
Mm-hmm. The House voted yesterday 240 to 188 to reopen the Treasury Department and the IRS. Again, McConnell has said so far he wouldn't even bring that up in the Senate, even though this was the same bill they passed.
Yeah, by unanimous consent.
Right, before. What's on the agenda today?
Well, we're going to pass two more of the appropriations bills. One is the transportation and HUD appropriation, and then we're also doing the agriculture bill, which has the SNAP provisions, which are very important. So we're going to force the Senate to go on the record. Hopefully they'll go on the record. I mean, Mitch may not bring it up, but that makes a statement in itself that the Republicans in the Senate don't want people to eat, that they don't want people to get their tax refunds, and that they don't want people to get their housing support. But I think this is a very smart strategy to actually one by one make the Senate respond to the very significant human cost of this shutdown.
Each of these federal agencies does extremely important work, and for having them shut down is causing a lot of suffering among the American people. Particularly, I think of interest today is, as you indicated, the Department of Agriculture. One is the food stamp program, which is a lifeline for millions of Americans. I'm sure in your state, your district.
Actually, in Kentucky, in total, there are about just short of 1 million people out of 4.4 million people on SNAP. In my district, about 100,000.
A quarter of the population.
Yeah, and in for instance, in Hal Rogers' district, which is Appalachia, out of his 700 some odd constituents, 170,000 of them are on a SNAP. So yes, it has massive consequences in Kentucky and in many places.
And then the other is food inspections under the FDA, which we all just take for granted, that what we're buying at the supermarkets has passed inspection and that they're out there on the job. They're not now.
They're not. And that I think that FDA said that they were, and USDA said they're going to have to restrict their inspections to high-risk things, and they were basically going to have to ignore a lot of the inspections they would normally do, which is not comforting.
Right. As chair of the House Budget Committee, will you be looking? Well, let's just hope the shutdown doesn't continue beyond that. But do you plan to look at some of the impacts of this shutdown on the average American families and how?
Well, I think there's going to be plenty of people looking at that. In my district, for instance, we have just across the Ohio River in Indiana a Census Bureau office. There's 1,700 employees there. They're all furloughed now, and they have no guarantee of being paid for the time they've lost. A lot of them live in my district because they commute. Yeah. So, but you take 1,700 people and out of a community, and we're one community in terms of the economy, and take all that money out of the economy, it hurts everybody.
Well, why wouldn't they be paid? I thought that was the deal, that they're furloughed, but they're paid when the government finally reopens.
Not necessarily. The people who are essential employees, who are working, get paid. So you're talking about the Border Patrol and FBI agents and TSA and those people. But the furloughed employees don't necessarily. We're probably going to have to pass legislation to pay them because they actually aren't working.
What is it going to take to end the shutdown?
I'm not sure. We're dealing with a very irrational person in the White House, and we're dealing with a party that is enthralled to him, or at least they're paralyzed by the same fears that I mentioned about Mitch McConnell, that if they take Mitch on, that they're going to be if they take Trump on, don't support him, they're going to be primaried in 2020. Clearly, Republicans want the government to be open. They voted to fund the government unanimously in the Senate, and we had no problem in the House. Of course, in the House, the then Speaker Ryan kind of caved into Trump and added the border wall money at the end when we shouldn't have done that. I think the obvious deal would be one which funds the 8 agencies that are shut down other than Homeland Security, and then continuing resolution for Homeland Security until we can negotiate the border security provision. Trump won't go for that. So I suspect the only way out is for Trump to declare this national emergency and then say he fixed it, which, of course, it's one of those other things. He set the fire, and then we'll take credit for putting it out.
Right. And is your read, I'm sure you've talked to some attorneys about this, that he does have the power to declare a national emergency?
He has the power to declare
Don't you have to prove that there is an emergency before you can?
No, he can declare a national emergency, but the law that follows that, where actually he gets to spend money, requires a different showing. And the question will be whether he can do that or not. But he can declare a national emergency at any minute, any time he wants to, for any reason. And that's why some people have said, well, and I think this is a legitimate point, if he's able to get away with that strategy, when there clearly is not a national emergency at the border, where by every metric, the security at the border is actually better than it's been. And in fact, 30 days ago, he tweeted out that the southern border is secure. So,
right.
You can't make the case logically or rationally, but he can say that and can actually declare it. But if he was able to get away with that strategy, then somebody in a different administration could say, well, we've got a national emergency because of climate change, and therefore go out and spend money to do away with all coal-fired power plants, for instance. So it's a very, very dangerous precedent to set. And
imagine if Barack Obama had done that.
Oh, my God.
Right?
Right.
Yeah.
Impeachment resolution in 5 seconds.
Absolutely. Rolling so fast.
Yeah.
Right. Also, if he declared a national emergency, it would be challenged in the courts.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Now, there's some question, I've heard lawyers discuss, there's some question as to who would have standing to sue. And I heard one constitutional expert saying it's not doubtful, but it is definitely questionable as to whether Congress has the right to sue, has standing to sue in that particular instance. But clearly, a lot of people would file suits, and Congress would be one of them. At least the House of Representatives clearly would.
Right. Yeah, and it seems to me something like that would go directly to the Supreme Court.
Yeah. But the fact of the matter is, Trump doesn't care. This is all about getting and keeping attention and diverting attention from the other things that are coming down. I mean, the story that broke yesterday with Manafort and handing political polling information to a Russian operative is about as clear-cut evidence as you could possibly have that there was a conspiracy between the Trump campaign and the Russian government.
And there was collusion. Yeah. Right.
Yeah, exactly. So he's got a lot to distract the people from, but he doesn't care about the wall. We all know that. It was a mnemonic device that was recommended to him, so he could remember to talk about immigration. We've already provided. The Congress has $1.6 billion for border security, of which he spent 6%. That was last year. So, and a wall would take years to build. Thousands of people who may not even be available, and there are no details as to where it would go, and it's just silly. But that's the world we live in right now, and unfortunately, in this particular case, a lot of people are being hurt.
Would the deal that some people are floating about throwing the Dreamers into the equation, and we'll trade you a wall for the Dreamers, would that fly among Democrats?
We talked about that in our caucus meeting yesterday, and actually there was overwhelming opposition to doing that. I thought it sounded like a pretty decent trade-off if we could get the Dreamers resolved for $5 billion, which probably would never be spent on a wall. But apparently the Dreamers themselves, the advocacy groups, think it's too high a price to pay. That they don't think that's a good trade-off. So they've actually, most of the advocacy groups for the Dreamers have said, don't make that deal.
It's interesting to me that the Republican side, they're never willing to support the Dreamers. They've had many opportunities to. I mean, and of course, Donald Trump's the one who blew up the program in the first place. But they're not willing to help it. But every time almost every time at least, there's some impasse on the budget, they suddenly remember the Dreamers, pull it out of their back pocket, and say, "How about this bargaining chip?"
That's true.
Right? That's how they only use it for that purpose.
That's right.
Every once in a while.
That's right. One of to me, the very strange things about this whole scenario is that the administration, in a negotiation, you always want to know what the other side wants. The Trump administration seems to think that keeping the government open is a concession to Democrats.
Yeah.
Which is ridiculous. And it was just like Mick Mulvaney, who's a friend of mine. I like Mick, but he was on Meet the Press Sunday, and Chuck Todd asked him that question, what are you willing to give? And Mick said, well, we've agreed to make it steel instead of concrete. That's not a concession at all. It's not anything Democrats care about. So we don't care whether it's a steel or concrete or plastic. It doesn't really make any difference. But that's where they've never been willing to concede anything to us again, except keeping the government open, which is the basic function of leadership.
Yeah, we saw how much the president was willing to negotiate yesterday when he said, "Okay, if I reopen the government, will you give me my wall?"
Right.
Yeah.
No, that's not a negotiation.
No. All right. And so, by the way, Donald Trump also says that the Democrats, ask for a steel wall, not a concrete wall.
No. I don't know anyone who asked for a steel wall.
But let me ask you this.
Yeah.
Do you know any federal employees who are not getting paid or are happy and to give up their paycheck to help with this wall, as Donald Trump keeps asserting?
We had one constituent call yesterday who works somewhere in the federal judiciary system, but a constituent, and she said, I'm okay with staying home as long as you don't agree to build the wall. So we had some
just
people,
the opposite.
Just the opposite. But we haven't had anybody say that they were happy about not being paid.
A couple of other issues you and I have talked so often about. By the way, on this point, before we move into it, I remember the days, Congressman, when you came in and we talked about, I think it was called the Gang of 8 or the Gang of 14. Mm-hmm. You were part of
Gang of 8 in 2013.
On immigration, and so close to coming up with a comprehensive immigration reform plan.
It's such a tragedy because in 2013 the Senate had passed on a bipartisan basis, 24 Republicans joining the Democrats.
A very good bill.
A very good bill. We, in this Gang of 8, worked for 7 months. At the end of 7 months, 7 of the 8 of us had signed off on a bill which we were confident would get 260 or 70 votes, and John Boehner would never bring it to the floor. And then two of the members of the Gang of 8 withdrew their support after the August recess, and it just went away. We wouldn't be where we are today if that had passed. And,
right.
And in that bill, we had something like $40 billion. In 2013 dollars, we had $40 billion for border security.
For border security,
yeah. And it was added personnel, and it was technology, and
it
so
was
forth.
a tragic missed opportunity. Yeah. Thank you, John Boehner. Yeah. Another issue that we've talked about, you have never had, to say the least, much support from the NRA. And yesterday, as one of the first items with the new democratically controlled House, a very strong bill on gun safety.
Yeah, on background checks. And, I'm thrilled that we're doing that. I wear my F pin on my lapel, which is my rating from the NRA.
I've been curious about that F rating or F. My lapel button.
Yeah, it's funny. About 8 or 9 months ago, we were at dinner, my wife and son and his then fiance, and I said, I'm thinking about getting a button that says "Proud to have an F rating from the NRA." And my now daughter-in-law said, "Don't do that. Just do an F." Mm-hmm. And I said, "You're right. That's brilliant." So I had these made. About a month or so later, took a picture of it on my lapel, tweeted it out. Within 2 days, had 45,000 likes and 8,500 retweets, which for me is a phenomenal amount. For some other people, it'd be normal day, but for me, it was amazing. So I gave pins out to a lot of my colleagues. They did the same thing. Everybody got a great reaction from it. And just a few months ago, the NRA announced they were taking the grading system off their website because, quote, our enemies are using them against us.
No, good for you.
So
that's great.
I mean, it's one of the best things I've ever done. So I wear this proudly every day, and it's great because people ask all the time. They say, "Oh, did you go to Fordham or something like that?" No, is that you F off to the world? No, this is my NRA grade, and people love it.
Yeah.
It's amazing. We've been doing this show for so long, and the NRA has been such a force for so long that we're actually at a point where we're watching them lose.
Their influence seems to be waning.
We beat 20 A-rated NRA House members this year, and 15 of our challengers were F-rated.
Really?
That's where that's how much the table has turned. And what we've seen is the people who have always been concerned about guns, safety, and obviously the urgency has and the impact of gun violence has just continued to mount over the years. But it was always, those people were always, when they asked about their voting priorities, the issues they cast their vote on, it was always around number 10, 11, or 12. Now it's number 2, 3, or 4, or even 1 in some cases. And so it's become a much different issue politically now. And that's great, because I think the tide has turned, and we will be able to actually get some of this stuff done over the next few years. Obviously, the Senate's not going to pass the background check bill. But anyway, I'm really happy we're doing that.
Oh boy, I was too. I was thrilled to see it. I didn't check carefully enough to know whether the bill has any Republicans at all.
I don't think it does. I don't think it does, but I wouldn't swear to that.
Right, and I saw that Congresswoman Gabby Giffords came back for the announcement yesterday. And another issue we've talked about extensively, because Kentucky had the best of all the state programs in terms of exchanges for the Affordable Care Act. You are looking at, as chairman, some single-payer health care?
We're going to hold hearings on single-payer plans, on a variety of options, including Medicare for All, to try to gauge what the impact of various options would be on the budget. Basically, trying to answer the question, can we afford to do this? And what would be the impact? And how much revenue would we need to make it happen? And I think that's an important exercise that we're going to be going through. We've asked CBO to give us a report on all the things that we have to consider in analyzing it. So, for instance, would insurance companies be part of it? In Bernie Sanders' proposal, you can't sell private insurance, so insurance companies go away. And Bernie's plan is not Medicare for all. It doesn't. It has nothing in common with Medicare for all. It's universal health care on demand with no contribution by the consumer. I don't think that's feasible. But Pramila Jayapal from Washington State, she's going to introduce a Medicare for all bill, which will be H.R. 676, which has been it started with John Conyers years ago. It's always been kind of the benchmark. So we'll consider whatever she comes up with, again, with other options, potentially a public option, extending Medicare to people 55 and older. There'll be a lot of things considered. But again, I think it's going to be a very important exercise for us to go through and the Congress to go through.
Absolutely. It is the key question, I believe. I mean, everybody says, we support universal health care, right? Everybody should. So then how do you do it, and how do you pay for it? And that's always been, it sounds good, but we can't afford it. I mean, what you're saying is you're going to find out exactly what the cost would be.
What it would cost to do these variety of alternatives. Medicare for All now polls extremely well. It's a significant majority of the American people want it because they understand Medicare, because they all know somebody who is a beneficiary of Medicare, who uses it. It's a program that has worked very effectively.
Absolutely.
And so the question is, how can we have everybody benefit from it, and what it would cost? I've talked to a number of Fortune 500 CEOs who will tell me privately, we have to go to Medicare for All. And they, for two reasons. They say, first of all, we can't afford to do this anymore. It's just murder. And we can't afford to compete globally with companies who do not have to provide health care.
Yeah.
And I remember a few years ago, General Motors said it's the most expensive part of the car is health care. So we've got to find an option, and we're going to see what we can do.
That's all for the America's Democrats podcast. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. Lori Wallach, Jeremy Brecher, and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook and Twitter. And leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. For the America's Democrats podcast, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.